Hello. I was just working on my temperature quilt here. I've got all of my parts all laid out and I'm stitching my rows. I got to thinking maybe you'd like to see how I go about putting these rows together. A couple of little tips and tricks that I have on making sure that everything fits really nicely and perfectly. And then when you go to add the other parts, it's all measured just right. I have a couple little tips on pressing the blocks. I also have a couple tips on pinning the blocks so that you get your nice straight rows. And it seemed like a good time to show you since I'm about to put the last 3 rows on this block. So if you're interested, definitely stick around. Hey, thanks for sticking around. So here's a couple little tips for getting your blocks nice and even. So what I've done with my temperature quilt, this is my March block, by the way. So there's one day missing, that's gonna be the tree. I haven't started the tree yet, but I'm getting caught up because I had a few things going on this month. And what I've got are, my roof for the block is done. I've also completed the first 2 rows and they are attached to the quilt. And you can see I have these nice straight seams. I finished the last 3 rows, but I haven't sewn them together yet because I thought I would just show you a few of the tips and tricks that I have to make sure that all of the stitching that I have goes into nice perfect rows and that my blocks always measure perfectly. So the first tip that I have when you're sewing your 2 squares together, there's my background square and my colored square. I use a tool like this guy and I draw a line down through the center of the block so that I can sew 1/4 inch on either side of the line. And these little tools, there's a couple different versions. This one has little holes down the center. I just draw my line down the center and I use my foot to guide the 1/4 inch seam on either side. But you could draw a line down the center and also draw the stitching line on either side. So there's a few different types of these tools, but that's very handy to make sure that you are stitching exactly through the center of the block. Make sure that each one of your triangles is the right size. I'm gonna trim these triangles apart by cutting through that center line, but before I open them up and press them, I'm gonna use my trimmer. This is a Clearly Perfect Slotted Trimmer, which is probably the best tool I have in my studio for working with half square triangles. Once I cut these apart, I'm gonna lay my triangle down on this ruler and I'm gonna trim it to size, to the perfect size, before I open it up and press it. And I'm gonna show you why. I left this mess right here on my sewing table so you could see why. Do you see all those little slivers? Some of those slivers are close to 1/8 inch wide. Even if they're 1/16 inch wide, remember every little mistake or every little overage or underage, if that's even a word, creates a exponential error. So I have 6 squares in a row here. Let's say it's 1/16 inch. 2 of those is 1/8 inch. 2 more of those is 1/4 inch. Next thing you know, you have something that is like nearly 1/2 inch too big. And then things don't get lined up correctly because this block right here only really has 2 seams. So even if I made the same amount of error in that block, I'm not coming anywhere close to the accumulated error in all these squares. And that's really the cautionary tale when you have a block that's made up of lots of parts. So I'm gonna trim all this mess that's not right out of the block and throw it right in the trash. And then I'm gonna open it up and press it. So the next little tip I have for you is in pressing itself. And that's the last thing that I wanna show you, pressing and pinning. So when we're pressing these blocks, I've got 3 different ways that I'm pressing this block. The first way that I have is I have all these little individual half square triangles. And you'll notice that I did take the trimmer, I did take the time to trim out all the little dog ears off of this because you know, they just get in the way, and because these blocks are really small and those are 1/4 inch points, I just want to reduce the bulk. Speaking of reducing bulk, I have taken the seams for every single one of these little tiny units and I've pressed them open. And that's gonna help reduce the bulk of having a seam folded over one side or the other. Right where all those seams meet and all those little points meet is gonna be just a little bit less bulky when I open up the seams. So the first thing that I'm doing when I do my half square triangles is press the seams open. Now let's look at the next row of units that I have to add to the block that I'm working on. Let's look at the back of that one, shall we? So you can see all of my half square triangle seams are pressed open, but all of the seams that I have from sewing the squares together are all pressed to one side. And that's really a critical point in how I'm going to not only reduce the bulk of the whole quilt or the whole block, but I'm also going to use this method to be able to lock the seams of my rows, and that's how I get those nice straight lines. So let me show you exactly what I mean by locking those seams. Let's look at the block. Right now I have my roof on. Let's look at the chimney at first. So on the chimney, I press the seams to the dark. There's no points in this, and I'm not worried so much about bulk on the chimney, and I have this light colored sky, so I pressed my seams in. But then you'll notice that when I sewed my chimney to my roof line, I pressed my seam open. Again, that's just to help reduce bulk because the row below it has some triangles in it. And I wanted to make sure that I could not have so much bulk by pressing from one side or the other. So I've pressed those seams open. So every time I've done a row, I've pressed the seam of the row open. Now let's look at the first row of triangles. So you can see where I attached the row of triangles to the roof, I've pressed the seam open. And each time I've sewn the triangles together, I've pressed the seam open. But let's look at the first row. So the first row, as I sewed the blocks together, I pressed all the seams of the blocks in this direction. And then on the row below it, I've pressed all the seams in the opposite direction. That's so I can get these seams to lock. So now I'm gonna add the row that goes below that one. This is row number 3. And I'm just gonna lay this row down here on my block, and then I'm gonna show you what I mean by locking my seams. So this is how the row is gonna get attached. And then let's look really closely at what I've got going on with my seams. So I have sewn or pressed all of the seams from the row on the bottom of the block in that direction. And the row that I'm about to add has all the seams pressed in that direction. And then let's see what happens to the seam. So can you see where they go together? If I just nest those two folded seams together right there, I can eliminate the gap between those seams, and I can actually kind of work them back and forth with my finger and get them to nest completely together. You see that? So that keeps those seams nice and flat, and I'm actually kind of pressing that in, and then you can see it meets on the end. And so I'm gonna put a pin in here so that I can make sure that this seam doesn't come open or slide one side or the other, and because they're folded like that, they're gonna nest. So now I'm gonna show you my trick to pin. I like being able to see the top of the block. So let's work from the other side, and we'll nest this seam so I can pin in the right direction. I'm gonna nest the seam again. You see I have one going in one direction and one going in the other. So I'm just gonna push them together, kind of get them to lock or nest together. And that's right, and my end meets. So I'm gonna take my pin. This is how I'm gonna put it through my sewing machine. So I'm gonna take my pin and I'm gonna insert my pin down here away from where the seam is actually locking, and I'm gonna put it in about probably a quarter of an inch or so away from that seam, and then I'm gonna come up at an angle so that the pin actually goes through where the seam is. You see that? And what that does is it actually holds the seam locked where it's supposed to be. I can kind of move these, you can pin the end too, but I can kind of move these together. And my seam is gonna stay nice and straight. And then I'm gonna be able to sew right down with my needle and I'm going to be able to insert my needle right down into that seam, but it's nowhere near the pin because I don't want to run over pins with my sewing machine. So I'm going to be able to sew down, drop my needle right into that seam. Then I'm going to pull the pin out. Then I'm going to keep on sewing. So I'm actually going to pin all my seams like that. So the next seam I've got, I'm going to nest together, and then I'm going to insert my pin a little bit further, about 1/4 of an inch further past the seam from where I'm sewing, and then add an angle up into the seam. This is what it looks like when I'm pinning it, okay? And then I'm going to keep on going and nest the next seam. And you can move it around a little bit. If you feel like your block's got a little gap or whatever, this is the time to be able to shift it and just get it right. And then I'm going to pin that seam. And I'm actually going to pin each and every one of these seams that I want to be straight. This works with putting pieces of a block together like I'm doing, sewing rows of blocks together, adding your sashing strips, sashing squares, whatever it is that you need to have meet in a very straight line. This method works great. And somebody who is very, very good at sewing taught me how to do this so that I'm not sewing over any pins, but I can hold the seam together very nicely. And there we go. So this is how my block is pinned. You see the angle with which my pins are all facing me. So let's sew it, and I'll show you exactly what I do when I'm sewing. I have my block underneath my sewing machine. All my pins are at an angle coming towards me. So I'm going to start sewing. Oh, of course you are, because someone's watching me on camera. See, happens to me too. All right, I'm going to make sure all my seams are going in the right direction under here. So my seam is going in that way, and I am sewing down. There's my pin. I'm going to sew right down and put my needle right in the seam line. My needle's in the seam line. My pin's all the way off to this side. I can slide my pin right out, and my needle's down in that seam, so it's going to hold that seam really nicely, and then I'm just going to keep on going. Making sure my seams are going in the right direction. Boop. Right down in there, pull the pin out, keep on going. I'm actually going pretty fast for showing you what I'm doing, but there we go. Pin needles right down in there, pull the pin out, make sure all my seams are going straight and in the right direction. It's gonna help with that bulk so much, because when you go to open this up, with all those little tiny seams there, it's going to be just a lot of little lumps. What I mean by bulk is all the little lumps and bumps that you have when you open the quilt back up. And there we go. That's my last pin. Really. All right. It's all done. Moment of truth. Let's open it up and see what it looks like. Woof. Pretty neat. So it's not pressed yet, but all those rows are nice and straight, and that's exactly how I want it to go. So now I'm going to take this over to the iron, and I'm going to take this seam right here and open it up. And it takes a few minutes to open it up, but again, this is just keeping the bulk down. So here's where, I mean, I have this point, these two little kind of edges here. So I'm just going to open it up nice and straight and square and press it open just like that. And that will help right here where all these little corner points meet. It just helps reduce that bulk a little bit, and it kind of spreads that bulk out, okay? And then we'll come back and I'll pin another one. Hey gang. So I pressed these all nice and flat, and then I've gone ahead and added my next row because I just have this one and one more to add, and then the block is done. And you can see there, this is how it goes into my sewing machine. So all my pins are at an angle sort of facing me that I can pull out right when I put the needle down in. So everything is pinned nicely, everything is nested nicely. I'm gonna make sure that the ends are lined up, and off we go to the races. Well, as I was saying, you never ever ever want to sew over your pins. And it was very weird that I wound up running out of battery in the camera and also bobbin threaded almost exactly the same time. But I've gone ahead and added my last 3 rows using that pinning technique I just showed you, and all the rows are nice and straight and everything is pinned or pressed open on the back on those rows. And that helps to make my block lie nice and flat. It's gonna be great for long arming afterwards. It fits really nice. Those are my tried and true tips for making this quilt as easy as possible. And while we were sitting there, I added some blocks today. I had a couple of blocks that didn't have any half square triangles, so I went ahead and made those today as the sample. So I have 2 more squares ready to go for whatever's coming up. This quilt's really quite easy to keep up with, if I haven't said so before. I mean, really super easy to keep up with. You really only have to do a few minutes of sewing each week to keep up with it, so there's plenty of time to finish up. Right now I'm finishing up March, so this is March, my March all the way up to March 30th. I'm gonna go ahead and quickly make my tree and then sew it to the side, and I'm done with the whole first quarter of the quilt. And you can see here in North Carolina, it's getting a whole lot warmer. So it's actually up in the 80s, or it was a couple of days ago. So if we could just get through the pollen, that would be great. I hope you are glad to join me. I hope you learned something. And remember, you can angle your pinning. You can always angle your pinning. I angle my pinning even on my borders, even when I don't have something to lock, because I can sew and sew and sew and sew. And it's just a good habit to get out of, to pull your pins out like that, right kind of towards you. So you can do that. You can do it any way you want, but it's a pretty handy way to pin. And you can also put your pin in a couple of times if you're running a really long border, and that helps keep it shifting from side to side as well. So I hope you learned something, and thanks for joining me today. And I hope that the progress you're making on your temperature quilt is going along swimmingly. So until next time, happy quilting.